So people like have been complaining about like what Chomsky said about how the Ukraine war or how the Russian invasion could end, specifically this part of the article. He said, well, I would not criticize Zelensky. He's acting with great courage, great integrity. You can understand and sympathize with his position, as in his position to ask for direct military intervention and such from where he sits. However, the Pentagon has a wiser stand. Yes, we could enter the war, we could provide Zelensky with jet planes and advanced weapons, but pretty soon Putin would be radically escalating the attack on Ukraine, would wipe it out, which he has the capacity to do. He would be attacking the supply chains that are providing advanced weapons, and we'd be in a war, which would be a nuclear war, which would wipe us all out. Yeah, that's pretty uncontroversially true. There's not really much of a way that you can get angry about that. He goes on to say, so I'm not criticizing Zelensky. He's an honorable person and has shown great courage. You can sympathize with his positions. But you can also pay attention to the reality of the world, and that's what it implies. I'll go back to what I said before. There are basically two options. One option is to pursue the policy that we are now following, to quote Ambassador Freeman again, to fight Russia the last Ukrainian. Did the ambassador really say that? Oh no, that's like no, that's not, he's not the actual ambassador. He was a former ambassador and he said that. And yes, we can pursue the policy with the possibility of nuclear war, or we can face the reality of the only alternative is a diplomatic settlement, which will be ugly. It will give Putin and his narrow circle an escape hatch. It will say, here's how you can get out without destroying Ukraine and going on to destroy the world. We know the basic framework is neutralization of Ukraine, some kind of accommodation for the Donbass region with a high level of autonomy, maybe within some federal structure in Ukraine, and recognizing that, like it or not, Crimea is not on the table. You may not like it, you may not like the fact that there's a hurricane coming tomorrow, but you can't stop it by saying, I don't like hurricanes or I don't recognize hurricanes. That doesn't do any good. And the fact of the matter is, every rational analyst knows that Crimea is for now off the table. That's the alternative to the destruction of Ukraine and nuclear war. You can make heroic statements if you'd like about not liking hurricanes and not liking the solution, but that's not doing anyone any good. I mean, yeah, this is just objectively true. It's very weird to me that people who are like, you have to vote for Joe Biden or you're not pragmatic or you're just making heroic statements, basically exactly what he says here, are now like, the only possible option here is to have Ukraine fight to like the bitter end, even if it's impossible for them to take everything back. The fact of the matter is that the chance that Ukraine is going to be able to take back the Russian occupied areas in the Donbass, and especially Crimea, especially not Crimea, is incredibly small. It's not only is it incredibly small, but even if they could do it, the human cost would not even remotely be worth it. I don't know if people don't get it. Most wars don't end with Hitler in his Führer bunker shooting himself in the head. They end with both sides sort of saying, okay, we want to end this war. What's the best way that we can do it while still having both sides sort of be able to save face or at least get something out of it? So like, what he's saying here is just objectively correct. It's incredibly unlikely that Ukraine will be able to take Donbass. And even if they did take it, they still wouldn't be able to take Crimea. And doing so would have a massive human cost. Remember that Ukraine has been trying to retake Donbass for the last 8 years, and they haven't succeeded either. So I'm not sure why people think they're suddenly going to be able to do it now that the full force of the overt Russian army is there, rather than just like Russian soldiers masquerading as separatists in limited number. People seem to be like,
communism
either you say that Ukraine should fight in the east, like devastating their own country, probably hundreds of thousands more people dying, or Ukraine can push Russia back as much as they can, which realistically would only really be to like the pre-war situation of like Russia occupying Crimea and Donbass, and then get on the negotiating table and come to some sort of agreement to end the war. That's obviously the better option. It's also the only realistic option because Ukraine is not taking Crimea back, and they're almost certainly not taking Donbass back. Like, people have incredibly unrealistic expectations for the Ukrainian military just because they pushed Russia back in Kiev in the north. But taking the regions that Russia had already occupied for almost a decade back is an entirely different prospect, especially since Russia is literally currently making gains in the east. And especially when you consider the fact that most people in Crimea, according to Western polls, by the way, want to be part of Russia. I'm not going to make a comment on whether that makes it legitimate or not. I'm just saying that what that indicates is that the people of Crimea would probably be more like they would probably resist Ukraine trying to retake the region. So that's sort of very unrealistic. And it's also very unrealistic for Gallup conducted an immediate post-referendum survey of Ukraine and Crimea and published their results in April 2014. Gallup reported that among the population of Crimea, 93.6% of ethnic Russians and 98.4% of ethnic Ukrainians believe the result of the referendum for Crimea joining Russia accurately represented the will of the Crimean people. Pew Research later released another poll that encompassed Crimea, Ukraine, and Russia, in which it was reported that 88% of Crimeans believe the government of Kiev should officially recognize the result of Crimea's referendum. So those are Western polling organizations. Crimea rejoining Ukraine is obviously incredibly unrealistic. So if you want to prevent further death and suffering in Ukraine, which the Ukrainians obviously do, even Zelensky is open to a negotiation. Obviously. The answer is Ukraine keeps fighting to the point where Russia accepts some sort of reasonable terms from them, and then they come to an agreement. And that agreement is almost certainly going to involve them recognizing Russian sovereignty over Crimea. As it doesn't matter if you think that's wrong or not, they're going to have to do it. Because Russia has already occupied Crimea. It's already occupied Crimea for almost a decade. You're not going to be able to demand regions in a war that you don't occupy, that you haven't actually retaken. You don't have leverage to do that. And as for the Luhansk and Donetsk, that's more iffy. It all depends on what sort of military gains Ukraine gains, but at the very least, as Chomsky said, you would probably expect some sort of negotiated settlement of them being given more autonomy within Ukraine at least. And then Ukraine pledging not to join NATO or something like that, neutrality or whatever. That's realistic. And as Chomsky said, it doesn't matter if you think it's good or not. If you think that would be worse than the only realistic alternative, which is Ukraine essentially just fighting and fighting and fighting and fighting until hundreds of thousands, if not millions more people die. You're just fucking bloodthirsty or something. It's not going to work. It's like saying, man, Ireland should immediately take up arms against the UK and fight to take Northern Ireland back. It doesn't matter how many of them fucking die in the process. They have to do it because that's the morally correct thing to happen here. It's their sovereign territory. They have to do it. Without thinking about how that would just completely devastate Ireland. They'd have no chance of winning. To frame Chomsky here as being pro-Russia for simply acknowledging reality. The reality where, Ukraine managed to push Russia back in the north from Kiev and stuff. They're probably not going to be able to push them out of the east, and especially not out of Crimea. Especially not out of Crimea because most of the population there seems to be happy being a part of Russia, whether you like that or not. It's funny because Chomsky is also a two-statist, for example, in Palestine, Israel. He's a two-statist. And he's not a two-statist because he thinks that's the just solution, because he thinks it's the most viable solution. I guarantee you that most of these people are two-statists as well. But in this case, they're just so rabidly caught up in the moment here that if they even have any sort of rational inhibitors in their brain, have just been completely turned off. This war is not going to end with Putin shooting himself in the Führer bunker in Moscow. It's going to end with Russia being forced to the negotiating table somehow by Ukraine stalling them in the east, and a negotiated settlement that allows Russia to save face is going to prevent hundreds of thousands of deaths. And that's good. You should not want Ukraine to fight what is unfortunately probably for hopeless objectives like retaking the already occupied territories in the east, because that's probably not going to happen. They could maybe retake Mariupol and some of the other cities that Russia has taken, some of the other towns that Russia has taken, the Russian advances, but the idea that they could be pushed out of all of eastern Ukraine is absolutely fucking absurd. It's one thing to defend, it's another thing to attack. It's a lot easier to defend the north of Ukraine from the Russian advance than it is to attack already occupied territory. These people are just caught up in a completely unrealistic sort of demand that not even Zelensky and his government themselves seem to be upholding. They've been willing to negotiate from the very beginning. For some reason, Americans and Western Europeans want Ukraine to just fight until everyone's dead. Probably the very best outcome here for everyone involved would be some sort of negotiated settlement that just restores the status quo from pre-war. So Ukraine probably wouldn't have to recognize the Russian annexed territory or anything, or the Russian separatist territories or whatever. Sort of like Taiwan, China sort of thing, where both sides just like have their own official stances and just operate business as usual while pretending that nothing ever happened. Like, I don't understand where these people get the idea that Ukraine is like so dominant militarily that they're just going to easily be able to take the occupied areas of the Donbass and Crimea.
Communism is based.
And Noam Chomsky saying that they can't is apparently insane or something. No, what he's saying here is true. And as he said, you can make heroic statements if you like about not liking hurricanes and not liking the solutions, but that's not doing anyone any good. Yeah, it's not. It's factually not. How are you getting angry at him for this? Are you fucking moronic? Like, someone straight up says, the way that this war is ending is through some sort of settlement between the two sides. Yeah, that's true. That's the way the war is going to end. The only possible way that it doesn't end like that is if Ukraine fights to retake all of the occupied East, and Russia eventually says fuck this and leaves, which isn't going to happen. I'm sorry. If it does happen, it would be some sort of fucking. I wouldn't even call it. It would be a military miracle, but it would be a humanitarian disaster because hundreds of thousands of people would die for that. And I don't think Ukraine. Luckily, I don't think Ukraine actually wants that. Because if Ukraine wanted that, they would have launched a full-scale re-invasion of Crimea a decade ago. Which, I mean, there has been conflict there, but not conflict in Donbass, but not on that scale. Not like hundreds of thousands of troops trying to retake it. I'm sorry, but Putin is not going to be shooting himself in the head in the Fuhrer bunker. You're going to have to negotiate with him. I mean, even if there was a coup against Putin, they at the very least wouldn't give up Crimea, whoever took it over. Russians think that Crimea is Russia overall. And whoever coups Putin, it definitely wouldn't be a liberal. There's no viable sort of liberal opposition in Russia. It wouldn't be some pro-West liberal. It would be like a more moderate nationalist. Like a nationalist who wants Donbass to be Russian but acknowledges that maybe it's less realistic for now. But yeah, Chomsky is just being totally reasonable and realistic here. The people who think that he's being like crazy here or something, or like being pro-Russian, they need to explain what is their solution to the war? What is their solution to the invasion? Is it for Ukraine to just keep fighting until they retake everything? A goal that is probably totally impossible? Is that your solution? That's a fucking terrible solution. So if you could make what Chomsky's dichotomy here, what he's basically saying is, if Ukraine can choose between recognizing, say, Russian sovereignty over Crimea and being forced to give more autonomy to Luhansk and Donetsk while keeping them a part of Ukraine, for example, and getting peace and preventing the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people, or fighting for years and years in order to retake those regions and hundreds of thousands of people dying and those regions being totally destroyed even more so than they already have. If you're choosing number two, you're a fucking psycho. I'm sorry. You're an absolute fucking psychopath. The first option is obviously the best option. And it's so weird to see people who... I mean, it's not weird. It's expected because they're not really honest about it. But people who always preach harm reduction and stuff suddenly are not interested in harm reduction. Suddenly, they're not interested in the pragmatic approach. They're interested in fucking fight to the fucking death for the sovereignty of a fucking one nation state over another. The harm reduction stance here is... It doesn't matter how unjust you think it is, because Ukraine is almost certainly not going to be able to push Russia out of the east, barring some sort of huge domestic pressure on Russia or something, which probably isn't going to happen. So the harm reduction stance here is, which by the way, the Ukrainians themselves are trying to fucking push. They want an agreement. They want to end the war. The harm reduction stance is some sort of settlement with Russia. You're not going to push them back to Moscow. Get over it. But the idea of harm reduction is it's a bullshit stance. It's not what they don't actually adhere to that at all. It's harm reduction when we need you to vote for Joe Biden, when we need you to vote for the right-wing party. But that goes out the window once we want Eastern Europeans to do a fucking blood sacrifice so that a certain flag can be flown, like a different flag can be flown over certain regions of Eastern Ukraine. Hundreds of thousands of people must die for this goal. So look, here's the question to these fucking morons, right? These bloodthirsty idiots. If you don't want Ukraine to come to a peace agreement with Russia, which will involve them giving some sort of concessions, because militarily, they're almost certainly not going to be able to push Russia out of the occupied eastern territories, aside from maybe the ones that they have taken since the war began. If you don't support that, that means that what you support is essentially a prolonged years-long war in which hundreds of thousands of people will die. And yeah, those deaths will be to obviously, we can blame Russia for those deaths. And we should blame Russia for those deaths. But they're dead anyway. They're dead regardless of who we blame for it. So just because those deaths aren't Ukraine's fault, it doesn't mean that it's some sort of fucking honorable thing for them to fucking fight and have hundreds of thousands of people die when they could pursue a peace settlement. That's where they want to. It's easy for you to be like this when you're not someone who's gonna fucking be killed as a consequence, okay? What's better for the actual people involved here is not them fighting to the fucking death to raise the Ukrainian flag over Crimea once again. It's pursuing some sort of agreement within reason to end the war as soon as possible. And if Ukraine is to one day regain sovereignty over, at the very least, Luhansk and Donetsk, or maybe Crimea in the future, that is something that would have to be pursued through diplomatic means, not through fucking war. Otherwise, well, I guess Argentina needs to invade the Malvinas Islands today. I'm sure you wouldn't support that. You know, wait for Putin to die, which shouldn't take long, honestly. He's like fucking in his 70s, and then push the issue diplomatically. Why fight a fucking war in which 100,000 people will die, and which has a very small chance of altering the status quo of the last decade? There's no fucking point. And they know there's no point to that. That's why Zelensky doesn't want to do it if he can avoid it. You guys are just fucking bloodthirsty morons. It's like Russia is evil. Ukraine cannot concede anything to the evil Russian hordes. That's about all there is to it. Chomsky is 100% correct here. It's not that he's wrong. It's not that Chomsky has become a right-wing pro-Russian or anything, and that you guys used to like him, but now he's become bad. It's that you've become more right-wing. All these people who used to like hold up Chomsky as like their pet intellectual, like Vorsh used to do all the time. He had Chomsky in his fucking Twitter banner for years. It's not that Chomsky has changed. It's that you never actually read anything that he wrote. And now that what he's writing is relevant to something that you're talking about, and you see his 100% correct stance on it, you have a sort of revulsion to it because you were never in line with his politics in the first place. You've always been a right-winger. It's not that Chomsky is getting worse. It's that you're just a right-winger. And that goes for all these people who have pretended to like Chomsky for years, but who have never actually read a fucking word that he said. He's 100% right here. Get over it. Jesus.